welcome to Documental. I'm your host and producer, Whitney Fishburne. On this episode, I'll be speaking with botanist and astrologer, Lee Lehman. Dr. Lehman is a medical astrologer in particular. And if you're wondering what on earth is medical astrology, just hang on because we're going to get to that. But first, I'd like to give you some context. The concept of herd immunity burst into the public discourse in 2020 thanks to the pandemic. But in fact, it was in 2017 that I began the process for trademarking the idea of creating herd immunity to anxiety and depression. I believed that there was a connection between our public and economic policies and the skyrocketing rates of anxiety and depression that we were experiencing, as the pandemic actually made all too clear. Documental has a diverse audience. I like to think of myself as being along the lines of wherever you'd find Buckaroo Banzai, that adventure into the eighth dimension from the 1980s film, The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai. He said, in effect, wherever you go, there you are. Essentially, it's just the middle ground. And I know I'm there when I'm asking good questions that challenge the status quo. What these 3 years of essentially thinking out loud, as I have done with Documental, has taught me is that it's the status quo that holds the hierarchies in place that we must destabilize if we are to take back our minds. But to do that, we need quality information, not conspiratorial fantasies. I like to believe in things that we can test, things we can prove, or at least replicate, even if it's not quantitatively driven. The scientific method means gathering all the information, all the possibilities. I've spent over 30 years writing about healthcare, medicine, health policy, and it's my work with academics and researchers that has actually caused me to question the totality of data. I'm not alone in this. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to bring these great guests, such as Dr. Lehman and also Dr. Victoria Sweet, who I had on earlier this year, discussing her two memoirs, God's Hotel and Slow Medicine. I've actually studied with Dr. Lehman. My interest in 17th century Western medicine came as a result of this odyssey. I believed when I started this journey that if enough of us took the right steps to heal ourselves of the anxiety and depression, we could then turn around and show others how to do the same thing. I still believe that. I didn't know the steps at the time, but they get clearer every time I work on Documental. Here's something else that's become clear. The more I question the status quo, the more I am able to reject the hierarchy's bullying way of shaming me out of my curiosity. And it's possible to do this without turning into a fanatic. Asking better questions is what has led me here to you. And it's what's led you here to me. And wherever you go, there you are. So now on to this interview. It definitely challenges the status quo. I'd like to welcome Lee Lehman. She is a botanist by training. She has her PhD in botany from Rutgers University, but she's actually a practicing medical astrologer, among other types of astrology. But medical astrology is Dr. Lehman's specialty. And so on this edition of Documental, I wanted to get an idea of what is medical astrology, why should we care about it in the context of medicine versus healthcare, which I have been talking about for a while now, is just the industrialization of medicine in the West. In other words, what did we forget? What did the status quo in its industrialization of our healthcare make us forget we once knew? So welcome to Documental, Dr. Lehman. It's so great to see you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So let's just start with what the heck is a medical astrologer?
Medical astrologer is somebody who uses astrology to look at human health. Now, I have to distinguish that there are many kinds of medical astrologers. The type I am is the kind that looks at it from a historical context. All I am doing is what astrologers did, say, 300 years ago. The medicine of the time, which was a humorally based Hippocratic Hellenic medicine, was strongly paired by a number of physicians and other practitioners with astrology. When the humoral system of medical practice started to break down, it was also a period where the general societal support of astrology also started to break down. So from my standpoint, I am simply looking at disease the way it used to be looked at. I would be incapable of saying very much about disease as it's currently understood. But I think one of the things that this addresses is when you start looking at the concept that there are many forms of medicine that have been developed. All of those are not the quote modern system of Western medicine for a number of reasons, pretty much all except that one modern system of Western medicine have been assumed to be somehow bogus or lesser. Therefore, with my saying humoral medicine, it becomes very easy for some people to say, oh, hardy, har, har, we don't really have sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, and melancholic people. Well, actually, we do. It's just what you do with that fact and how you interpret it.
Yeah, so but let's make sure that the audience knows what we talk about when we say humors. Back in the 70s, I learned that in I don't even know why I was taught that in grammar school, but I was taught that the humors were something that used to be used when evaluating a person, and then they came up again in the history of psychology when in college. And I know from studying it now that it has to do with not just the Hippocratic system of medicine, but Galen also used the humors. What are they? And then what you named them, but let's get into them a little bit more, because I think that is a great place to talk about how what you do, even if you can't necessarily identify diseases, is really a personalized form of medicine. So if you could just explain the humors and what they are.
To understand the humors, you have to go back to about the 5th century BC and the development of the Greek systems of philosophy, and specifically what they called natural philosophy, which is what might now be characterized as primitive science. And the philosophers of that period were very interested in the question of how many fundamental, so to speak, fundamental elements, as they ultimately called them, were. How many different things do you have to have in order to have all of the matter that exists on the earth? And through a gradual process of working with this, they came to the conclusion of the number was 4/5. And each of those was characterized, and those were fire, air, water, and earth. And each of those were considered to have fundamental properties, and everything on the earth was basically a combination of those 4 elements. Now, this is very different than what we have now with a periodic table, but that was their idea. At the same time that this was happening, a form of empirical medicine was developing, where before that time, the tendency with medicine was to see disease as primarily being the result of, well, to be brutally simple, pissing off a deity. And so, you stepped on a plant that was sacred to a particular deity, and so they were going to say, you stupid idiot, and so they give you boils. Greek medicine was moving out of that and into more of the idea that if you see 2 people who each manifest a fever, and the fever is accompanied by chills and sweat, and recurs about every 6 hours, that those 2 fevers may be related. And they're related in the sense that if you can therefore find an herb, because most of the medicinals of that time were herbs, so if you can find an herb that worked in case 1, the odds are it could work in case 2. In other words, this was a process of going from assuming that every single individual disease that happened to you was effectively random, and there was no relationship between your observations of the course of what happened, to a situation where they would say, okay, if you start to see this particular set of circumstances repeating, it means that it could be the same disease, and it's likely that it could be treated in the same way. Hippocrates in his school worked with this current scientific theory called the elements, and said, okay, well, each of those elements has traces in the body. And, I think it's also the difference between thinking that you've got to work on such a material basis that every molecule has a job and has a meaning, to more of a metaphorical, because while there was a physical basis for those 4 humors, they weren't just physical. They were the word humors referred actually to kinds of liquids, blood, which we all know we've got, something called yellow bile, which is kind of what we know from the gallbladder, but kind of not. And Then there is kind of the more whitish liquid. The phlegm that's in our noses is part of that, but there's a lot of other white liquids as well. And then the final one was called black bile, and it was more colored. It wasn't bright red like, bleeding out blood, but it was darker, possibly a little greasy. But the point was not that the entire body was just that. I mean, they knew, for example, that the bones had to be something more than that. And a certain amount of all of them was necessary for life, because they also thought that each of the various organs that we have had a tendency to have a dominance of one or more of those. We each individually have our own unique ratio of these four components. I would call it almost an epiphenomenon on top of the necessary physiological components of the humors. Now, where this theory went was to say that when your natural balance becomes unbalanced by, for example, the change in seasons, getting older, or just maturing, any kind of stress, all of those would tend to unbalance the body. And so then when the body is unbalanced, there's the potential for disease. When you study the astrology of an individual, you begin to be able to anticipate when such changes can occur, which now has two components. One is to be able to say, well, next year, what this is showing is that you could become ill. And, if you're being literal about it, you could say, well, because it looks like there's going to be an excess of black bile. But the other way of thinking about it is seeing that is the direction that things are going. Before the actual, so to speak, hit, you can start treating the person herbally, making changes in their lifestyle so that disease then never happens.
Okay, so let me stop you there. A couple of things. So when you say epiphenomenon, what you're saying is that we all are composed of these 4/5 elements, because I'm also thinking around this time there was the Chinese and the Ayurvedic systems that were looking at the body similarly, and the Chinese system has 5 because they have metal. Actually, the Ayurvedic has 3. I think they have 3 temperaments. But so basically, we have these elemental compositions that as human beings make us, human. These are the things that are the building blocks of humanity, and then humans. Then the epiphenomenon is, then I'm me, and so I happen to have more black bile than I would yellow bile.
Average human being would have.
Right, exactly. So that would make me what? That would make me melancholy. When you just said, that medical astrology would then allow you to predict what is coming so that you can prepare or treat what's happening in the moment, I don't think most of my audience will have any idea how that's possible. So that's sort of, that's where I don't know if it's possible to give a really straightforward way of explaining it, but that's what I hope we can do here.
All right, well, let's start with a relatively trivial one. Some months ago, a woman contacted me, and the problem was her partner was snoring. Now, really simple, everyday thing, but we can all relate to the fact that if your partner is snoring logs in the middle of the night, sooner or later, you're going to get pretty ornery about it. I cannot give her a modern medical answer of what that is, okay? Because number one, I'm just not up on the literature. Number two, I'm not licensed. And number three, I'm not running a sleep clinic. So I can't approach it on the same kind of level that it would be if this had been put to a modern medical practitioner. But what I could do was I could look at the chart for this question, and basically from it, I was able to, again, on a humoral level, say, okay, what's happening here is there's a problem with black bile. And I'm just interpreting the way it would have been interpreted in the 17th century or earlier, using the pharmacopoeia that was in place in that time. I gave her a suggestion for 3 herbs. In this sense, I'm more like an herbalist with this, but I'm an herbalist operating out of a particular set of herbs that were understood to have certain astrological relationships. The snoring disappeared virtually immediately, and she's a very happy camper right now.
What generally is the system that gives you those kinds of answers? How do you coordinate the planets to the body?
Two ways. First of all, the four humors correlate to the four elements that are used in astrology, just as they were in ancient medicine. So black bile correlates to the element earth. So what I was seeing in the chart that I was looking at was an excess of earth. Now, there are also planets that correlate to this. The planet that most correlates to black bile is Saturn. And in a sense, this is also the way that medicine worked in the old days. You know, the patient would come to the physician and basically say, I have this condition, like this woman said, you know, my partner has snoring. Then the physician would examine the patient. If that person was an astrological physician, they would draw up a chart for the moment of having seen that patient and use that chart to tell them about the nature of the disease and what the course of the disease was like. That's what I basically reproduced as a historical process, to then be able to say, okay, well, this is an excess of melancholy, and the herbs that most correlate to that, within these ancient systems, would be the three that I gave her.
So then basically what you're saying is that at the point in time that the person presents with their symptoms, and then you creating the chart for that moment in time, you're taking a snapshot of how they are reflecting the larger elements at play.
Yes.
Okay. So this is kind of like as above, so below. This is the true. I am an amalgam of elements, as is every single thing, as you were talking about back in the 5th century, or was it 5th century?
Yeah.
Yeah, when they were looking for ways to describe the scientific process of building and decaying.
Right.
Okay.
There's also another piece here, which is this had obviously been going on for a while. The thing that we would understand astrologically with this is she could have actually asked me that question for probably some months. The point, and this is kind of the sacred piece of the astrology, or the divinatory piece of the astrology, is she decided to ask me that question at that time. And so it's like the idea of, I know I've got a problem, came to a head in a moment where she said, now I've got to talk to somebody to get rid of the problem. And so this theory now says that she will come to that moment, a moment where I, as someone who can read a chart for a moment, can interpret it.
So when you say divinity, then in the sense it's kind of like the divine grace, like you'll get the answer when you most need it.
Or when you've gotten to the point where you can't stand it any longer, which is more like how it manifests.
Well, I don't know if we can get so much into the actual. Well, we should do that a little bit, though, is getting into that kind of the metaphysical perspective. But I still want to bring it back to the historical.
Mm-hmm.
You were talking about how this was the 17th century,
right.
And eventually it started to break down. And I'm wondering, did astrology in the medical setting go away after germ theory, or what was the reason why we abandoned it?
Basically, germ theory didn't come up until the 19th century because Pasteur wasn't the only one, of course, who was involved in the development of germ theory. Basically, through the Middle Ages, you had this humoral theory I'm talking about reigned supreme. It also reigned supreme at a time where there were a lot of other particular assumptions in medicine. The Renaissance brought a lot of changes to many of these historical processes. It was the realization that many of the older descriptions of human anatomy, some of which were based on other animals because they weren't allowed to do human dissections, were not accurate. But what happened with the humoral system is that it was also a time where astrology started to disconnect from the universities. And one of the things that I would point out is that for astrology was not so much the system that had to run the humoral system, it didn't. But astrology was a system for picking the time to do something. For someone who says, well, I just simply can't believe in astrology, so I can't believe that was true, take another position and say, well, suppose it was. And the suppose it was is if this was actually working and you had centuries of people saying it was working, and then you suddenly take it away and you mess up the timing system, suddenly the whole system goes kittywampus. Because now, for example, bloodletting. When printing presses started to pop up all over the place, one of the first thing all the printers did was they made wall calendars. Those calendars had Tuesday in red because Tuesday is Mars's day in the old system, and you see that in things like in the French, Tuesday is Mardi, which is of course the day, Mars's day. You don't do bloodletting on Tuesdays. It was because there's an old idea that you don't touch a part of the body ruled by the sign the moon is in, but
So
also Mars would be too strong.
So you're saying that bloodletting was I think you're saying this, bloodletting had protocols around it that were based on astrology in that it was all about the timing.
Right.
That it wouldn't be effective unless it was done according to the correct timing. Is that what you're saying?
Right. So now one of the things you see happening is, and we know there's been a lot of criticism looking back historically about how much excess bloodletting was done. Well, the astrological system was one of the things that stopped excess bloodletting.
But does bloodletting work, actually?
Well, small amounts of it do. When you talk about doing cupping, which got so popular as a discussion point in the last Olympics.
Right, because of Michael Phelps.
Exactly. That effectively is an analogous thing. Homeopathic physicians do bloodletting, but you're talking about tiny quantities of blood. You're not talking about you going in and giving blood at the hospital where you're giving a pint. You're talking about maybe a teaspoon. So what happened is you kind of had this disconnect between a system that would say, don't do it now. And the system otherwise go, well, they've got the symptoms, let's do it. As you had these changes in the understanding of anatomy and physiology, they didn't have anything to replace it with. So you had this sense of, well, we maybe aren't so happy with the humoral system, but what do we replace it with? That replacement was the germ theory, but that wasn't for a couple of centuries later. So they were kind of operating, but it was kind of like this automaton of the humoral system without understanding either the philosophy that was behind it or the astrology that was behind the timing system for it.
Why did the university stop teaching astrology as part of medicine? Was it because astrologers were wrong and it was just like, you guys, I don't want to believe you anymore because you're wrong? Was it because technology, I don't remember when Galileo discovered that he could, was it Jupiter that he first saw with the telescope? He had the telescope and he saw Jupiter.
He had seen Jupiter, of course, but it was the moons. It was the moons of Saturn. Jupiter. Galileo was an astrologer. Kepler was an astrologer. We've got kinds of horoscopes that they did. So it wasn't the fact that they discovered this stuff that had anything to do with that. What was happening was more a political issue that had nothing to do with medicine, but had to do with culture. Astrology was and had, for a long time, had been inserting itself into public affairs. When you had, for example, when you had the English Civil War in the middle of the 17th century, there were astrologers aligned on the side of Charles I, and there were astrologers that were aligned on the side of the Parliament. And they were making prognostications about who was going to win. Well, ultimately, the astrologers who were on the side of the Parliament predicted a lot of what happened when Charles was defeated and ultimately beheaded. So then you get the Restoration afterwards, and suddenly what they're seeing is astrology is a pretty dicey political system because you can actually tell when a monarch is going to screw up. So then you had a campaign going on that basically, it was a really good social media campaign for the time against astrology, which said, oh, well, the whole thing's bogus and it's silly and it's this and it's that. We've got something more, then let's assume that it worked in the history, which is going back to Roman law. There was a concept called a contract for a cure. All of medicine was actually really patient-driven. because it was the patient who decided what the disease was and how it would be treated and who would treat it. And because you had a medical environment in which there were always multiple forms of, as we would now say, healthcare practitioners. You could go to an herbalist, you could go to a barber surgeon, you could go to a physician, you could go to a priest if you thought it really was a spiritual disease. I mean, you had these and many more variations of them. But what would happen when you'd go, let's say, to an herbalist, and you'd say, I have this red spot on my hand. It's really itchy. It's driving me crazy. Can you cure it? The herbalist would say, well, yes, I can cure it, I think. And what I'm going to do is recommend that you take the following herbs. This is probably going to take somewhere between 3 or 6 months to go away. In other words, you see, I'm giving you very specific things. Now, the herbalist could say, now, I don't think it will completely go away, but the itchiness should go away. You may still have a residual redness afterwards. Okay? Very specific description. This is what I can do for you. That then set up a contract for a cure. And the understanding, pretty much from Roman times up to the 16th century, was the herbalist could not be paid a fee for curing you unless they cured it to the point that they stated in the contract.
You didn't pay unless you got better.
And we have plenty of historical evidence for this, including the fact that in Italy, there was a whole set of separate courts devoted to adjudicating these cases.
Okay, so it was kind of like malpractice suits.
Yeah, it was kind of like malpractice suits. But the fact is that we can't do this now because the basis of our current malpractice suit is that the physician actually made a mistake.
Right. Yeah, totally different.
Here it was saying, I will cure you, or I will cure you to this point. Now, if the medicine wasn't working, how was it that the system didn't break down for centuries?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So really, because what you're talking about is personalized medicine, patient-driven medicine. These are two things that the industrialization of healthcare talk about a lot. Patient-driven and efficiency and all of the things that they talk about, but it's really driven by saving money. This was just simply getting better, it sounds like to me. I mean, there was no middleman, there was no minister of health or insurance company. Although I do find it interesting that you're saying that there were these courts, so you could still have these kind of malpractice situations, but it was, as you just pointed out, it wasn't because the doctor made a mistake. It was how to measure what cure meant.
Because the physician or the other healthcare practitioner stated what they thought they could do for the patient. You can spend tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars to have the physician at the end of it say, well, I still don't know what's wrong with you. And because I don't know what's wrong with you, I don't know what to do for you. When somebody goes into, cancer therapy, a particular chemo is selected for them. Does the patient learn whether this chemo drug works at a level of 30% or 70%? If and I'm saying this should apply to all forms of medicine. If you're going to recommend to somebody that they should take this course of treatment, shouldn't the patient have some idea as to whether to expect that this will really work or that it's the best shot that this particular healthcare practitioner has?
I do think that those conversations get had, though, as to, we could do this. They will talk to you about your options.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that that's necessarily missing. What I think that is so fascinating about what you're talking about, though, is that there was this expectation that if you would enter into the contractual relationship with your healthcare practitioner, whomever it is, let's say it was the priest and you wanted an exorcist, or you wanted the sawbones, or you wanted the astrological herbalist doctor who probably was university trained, by the way.
Yeah.
That all things being equal and as they're supposed to be, put the malpractice court aside of the time, you would get what each of you expected.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever that happened to be, you would agree ahead of time. And then you would compensate the doctor. So there really was it was transactional. It was really transactional. Yeah, that is fascinating. So then we don't do that anymore, and I don't necessarily want to have you be we could talk about what you've alluded to. It was historical, it was political, and so there was this taking apart the timing aspect of astrology from medicine. And it wasn't just because of an attack on medicine, it was just overall this is the way history was advancing, where people who had astrology were seen by those in power as having too much power.
Mhm.
So let's break these apart. And then in the universities, you're saying that it was then kind of decoupled from the study of herbs and medicine. But then science advanced, and science brought better understanding of anatomy and so forth. So an obvious question then is, well, why would somebody come to you that aside from the fact that the healthcare system itself doesn't allow for these very honest, immediate transactional types of interactions between a doctor and a patient, because healthcare has become what it has become. Put that aside for a second. What efficacy can you bring to a situation now, and what would I gain if I wanted to come to a medical astrologer? And why would I maybe even start with you instead of a regular health practitioner? Or I guess you are a health practitioner. So why would I come to you instead of using my insurance card and going to the primary care and all that rigmarole?
Well, to me, the answer to that is, I'm not going to advertise my services as being superior to anybody else, because in the end, I am not someone who does treatment directly. I am not licensed in any form of healthcare. I do not have a license to touch. I don't have something like a massage therapy license, for example. So I am not anybody's primary care anything. If somebody needs to have a quad bypass, it is not my job and will never be my job to say, no, I think that's a really rotten idea. So my job is not to overrule uh, any licensed healthcare practitioner who has come to the conclusion that their best idea for this circumstance is, pick it. But my job is to say, okay, well, now, if you need to have a knee replacement, if you accept the astrological model that the time has unique qualities, because that's really all astrology is saying, is that this moment has certain qualitative differences from the next moment or the moment before. And if you also accept that that can be read astrologically, then my job is to come up with a better than average time for you to have the procedure that you need to have. It's not making the judgment over whether the procedure is necessary at all.
So, two things from that then. One is that you're still then looking at the body in that humoral way.
Mm-hmm.
And so that never actually was just, well, it does seem that it was discarded by modern medical science, but that doesn't mean that it was never true. It's still true. It's just not used. Is that an accurate statement?
Well, who knows what's true and not? I mean, it's a very waffly word, isn't it, Whitney? I think that the thing is that it's a different view of reality, and it's a view of reality where time can be understood using methods that aren't normally taught in a medical course, a chiropractic course, an acupuncture course.
Yeah, I had, as a guest earlier this year, I had Dr. Victoria Sweet, who wrote the book Slow Medicine, which was one of two books that she wrote. The other one was God's Hotel. When she learned from studying the works of Hildegard von Bingen, who was an abbess back in the, 1200s, that successful treatment of the patient was through this humoral approach, which was temporal. It was element, is the person a little too hot or a little too cold? And it was essentially like looking at a plant. You look at the plant within its environment. Is it dry? Is the soil dry? Does it need water? Does it need less draft? Does it need, more sunshine? And then when they looked at patients that way, when they looked at the human being in that temporal way, and they brought up the heat if it was too cold, or they added more moisture if it was too dry, and that sort of thing, that they had better health outcomes. And she started to look at her patients the same way, and she had better health outcomes. So I guess, what I'm saying is that you add this idea of then getting how you time those additions and subtractions uh, so that they're optimal and you can still affect the person's health today despite the modern science. Okay, so then what does what you do bring to the equation? One thing I'm thinking is, well, you could certainly help if you were to pair with doctors, you could help them avoid malpractice. But what do you bring to the? I mean, obviously, this is almost like I know I have listeners who are policy people who are like, "What the hell is she talking about? Bringing on medical astrology?" But I really am committed to looking at what the status quo has made us leave behind, because so much wisdom has been lost as a result of trying to fit into the status quo. And as you've already noted, this is centuries and centuries of working arithmetic when it comes to timing and helping people get to their optimal health. So what can we do now to bring what you do into, a more integrated way of taking care of ourselves?
Well, if you're talking about slow medicine, it's listening to the patient in a more profound way. It's not just running a chemical test or, or looking at a series of blood indicators and doing quantitative medicine. Now, I'm not saying that has no value. Of course it does. But there are other dimensions to the human body. I mean, look at one of the great mysteries of life is that when either people, or I'm going to include animals because so many of us live with our pets, and they're biological entities too, because this is a whole biological entity thing. When two different people, 10 different people get kidney disease, you don't get identical outcomes. What is the difference? Well, if you want to be completely materialistic about it, you say, okay, well, this person has, this titer of that and this titer of that and so forth. And, and what's the level of creatinine in the 10 individuals. But there are individual issues of vitality. There are individual issues of the human will. There's what happens, as, has happened to so many people this last year with COVID, the level of mental stress that so many people have been under. And stress is one of the big factors in disease. So what makes one person decide that they really want to live and another person decide, I'm out of here? These are factors which are not strictly quantitative numbers. And this is a system that looks at these areas of psyche and spirit, not directly by needing to use those words, but that there's a dimensionality of who we are that isn't just a set of numbers.
Well, one response to that from the system, the current system, would be, well, that's what we have consult liaison psychiatry for, or that's what we have mental health training for primary care doctors for, although there's precious little of that. But, are you saying that this is, I understand what you're saying, and I actually respect and I agree with what you're saying, that there has to be a vehicle for approaching the whole person and getting back to that divinity that we, as in the world of science, don't ever want to talk about, really. But are you saying that this is an adjunct that could potentially replace what we do as, when we add the element of mental health care? Or are you saying
that's certainly part of it, Whitney, but I think there's another piece here. You introduced me at the beginning as having a PhD in botany, which I do. I spent years in the lab, and I don't reject that. But I think there's another piece of it, which is that if you're talking about the scientific method, people who are doing it should be at truth, no more than agnostic. And this is the whole question, because the scientific method actually has nothing to say about divinity. It really doesn't. It has to say we are operating with matter and with that which is in front of us in a way where we can measure it and study it. But it doesn't imply that everything that could possibly be real is something that can be studied by this method. And that's the point. There's when this whole idea, the empirical method was developed, it was a mechanism for understanding that which was in front of us. It never had to say, and this is the only form of existence that there is. It's only really more recently, and among certain practitioners, that there's been this tendency to pretend that it somehow says that it's the only form of reality that can be. No, there's a form that can be studied this way. It's one ballpark. It doesn't say it's the entire universe.
You've been really, I mean, a practitioner, what, 40 years? When did you actually begin offering medical astrology consultations?
Oh, not when I started being an astrologer, but I started studying astrology when I was still in grad school at botany at Rutgers.
Okay, so what, 40 years? You mentioned 40 years, I think.
Yeah,
So,
so I was probably doing medical astrology maybe 10, 15 years after that.
okay, so a long time, like 30, maybe 35,
Yeah,
30 years. Let's just say 30 years.
yeah.
So, based on what you just said, then I'm wondering, do you find what you do a spiritual practice, or is it a scientific practice, or is it what is it?
Well, I've used the word historical because my own approach to it has been to study what the old systems in this were, because I think that since astrology developed to do this within a historical context, it's a mistake to not understand what that historical context was. Um, but I don't tend to put big boxes around things I do. I don't walk around during the day saying, "Oh, I've got to do my spiritual practice right now. I have to do my historical practice. I have to do my empirical practice." I just do it. And for me, it's a way of helping people. It's an extension of the astrological work I do. Um, and so that's simply what it is. My background, having come at this from having been a lab scientist, I have certain, I'm probably more quantitative than your average astrologer is in how I look at life. But coming at it from a historical point of view, that keeps me from making wrong assumptions or simply inventing everything as I go.
Hmm. Yeah, which I think is important, especially in a post-truth world.
Yeah.
There really do. I still think there has to be an if and a then, and then, a
Yeah.
way to test it as much as possible. But it's fascinating to me that, as an astrologer, you're saying, I can do that. I can do that.
Mhm.
I can test things. Now, most of your testing is probably empirical data, but
It has to be because this this gets back to actually some of your own theories of reality and the question of for a long time there were there were major historical arguments about how reliable sensory data was. And for much of our, and I'm going to call it academic history because this is the scholarly tradition too, not necessarily anything else. There were big questions about just how much you could capture with human observation. Now, obviously, we have computers and other devices now to help us, but you get back to a lot of questions about how much of the universe of realities and possibilities can be captured by one individual method. I'm not saying mine's comprehensive either.
so, who are the people who come to you? Are they people who are desperate because they can't get an answer from the system? Are they people who, you mentioned a person who's my partner is snoring and I can't get any sleep. That's just a pretty mundane, run of the mill. Any of us could relate to that sort of a thing. That's not a very woo woo situation.
No,
Yeah, I mean, and I guess the other thing I would wonder is you were talking about timing. So, do you have a lot of people who come to you and say, I have to have a surgery? What's going to be the best time? Who's your
I,
client?
I have probably, I would guess, at least a quarter of my practice is I have to have this particular surgery. When's the best time to do it?
And then back to that idea of the empirical data, they come back to you and you can't there's no control. You can't say, well, if you'd had the surgery on this day, then it would have been crap, but you had it on this day and it turned out well. So you don't have the control in that. You just are going to have that observational data. But generally, what are your odds?
They seem to be generally satisfied. There are cases that I see where what I'm looking at is essentially a case where, one way of putting it somewhat probably brutally is where I get to sense there's no hope.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get into the whole question about, do you therefore do nothing? I mean, and this has got to be a question that, and I don't want to, talk about anybody else's ethics in this, but obviously physicians have to realize with particular patients they're dealing with that the odds of success are low.
Mm-hmm.
But, you don't like to approach it as there's never any hope, because human beings are amazing entities, and they can do things. Some people, you tell them that there's no hope, and they get up and they decide, well, screw you, and they just do it, and out of pure ordinariness. And there are other people who collapse with that information. And you certainly don't want to cause anybody to collapse. But I mean, most of what I do is more on the level of that mundane snoring thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's people being concerned that, most of us, our goal in life is to not have to think about our health very much. You don't want to worry that you can't do something next week because you'll be sick. I mean, what we're seeing is how very neurotic our society gets when we're forced to, as we have been with COVID, to be thinking about our health all the time. Nobody wants to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So most of what I'm getting is people wanting to tweak things in their lifestyle, or know about something that could be coming on and say, okay, well, now what can I do to maybe mitigate, or if not prevent, mitigate the major effects because something's happening, or simply to understand a process that's happening.
I think you made a really important point, though, a couple minutes, or just backing up a little bit, where you were saying, you don't want to approach it where a situation is hopeless, because I would imagine that when people are coming to you, they think you have a lot of power that that you may or may not actually have, but they know they don't have, because they don't know how to read a chart. So they're going to, like in therapy, it'd be kind of like a transference type of thing, where they're looking to you to be their authority, or they want you to have the answers, or they're projecting things onto you, and you have to be really careful of that kind of thing. But if you see what you see, you also are ethically obligated. Any practitioner dealing with someone's health is ethically obligated, I think, to tell that person the truth.
Sure.
So that sounds tricky.
Really, what I'm saying is, if you do this at this particular time, your odds of success are less than in another particular period of time. So all of this is basically relevant. A good way of conceptualizing this, which is kind of a situation that happens not infrequently with my clients. So somebody comes to me and they've been diagnosed with cancer, which you certainly know from a psychological clinical point of view is like the one word nobody wants to hear. I'm looking at their birth chart for now and saying, okay, what are the health indicators going on right now? What are the disease indicators going on right now? And while what I'm seeing is not diagnostic in a strictly medical sense, what I'm seeing is that they have afflictions to their health. And I'm looking at it and I determined that the afflictions to the health are going to be lasting for 2 years, let's say. And I've had situations like this where somebody had just gotten the C diagnosis, and I'm looking and I see 3 consecutive terrible years. And I'm not dealing with the specifics of precisely what the disease is doing at this point, but just generally. So my job then, upon seeing this, is to say, if you do nothing, or you do kind of the normal course of things like, autopilot, your health is going to feel miserable for 3 years. Not that that the cancer is going to kill you within 3 years.
Well, two things come to mind. One is that then you have to be clear that it's not the stars that are causing these things. They are, according to what I'm understanding here, is that they are reflections of that above, below, as above, so below. So they're not compelling the person to their your ability to read them gives that person an option to say, here's the situation, I'll choose how I want to respond to it. Is that okay?
Yeah.
But you're doing all of this through the toolbox of a 17th century physician. So how are you dealing with things like, dialysis, or things that didn't exist then?
There's not a good mapping between the way that medicine was practiced in the 17th century and the way it is now. So in terms of running these tools, I have to be aware of them. Okay. And this is why I say I can't give anything remotely resembling a modern medical analysis, even if I wanted to, even though if I wanted to, that would be illegal. I'm giving an image of a metaphor of a temporal process. It's known, for example, somebody has high cholesterol. It can be dealt with by diet. It's just most people won't stick to the diet. And if you ask a physician that's what they'll basically tell you, that for most people, they'd rather take a pill than do the work of cleaning up their diet. But they have a choice to clean up their diet. Okay, so I'm not telling them which one to do.
Could any astrologer do this, or just what makes a good medical astrologer? What kinds of, because you keep saying, I'm not a medical practitioner and I don't necessarily know all of the things that a doctor would know, but what do you know that like a run-of-the-mill astrologer wouldn't know?
A large percentage of astrologers would classify themselves as primarily being psychological. Those people simply don't have the tools to do medical because the astrology they've studied has nothing to do with the medical process. Now, any psychological astrologer who wanted to study medical astrology could do so. The rules are different for working with a person about psychological issues than they are about medical issues. It's a specialty in that sense that there's a lot of material about how it was done, but you have to learn it.
I I realize that I'm an outlier by bringing this up, that most people who are in my typical audience would think this is crazy. Um, but I ask earnestly, is there the chance that what you do, what I'm interested in, what an increasing number of millennials are interested in, and they are the next generation who will eventually be the ones in power? So many already are. That this could be seen as just a normal thing in what we would consider at our disposal when we are looking to make informed healthcare choices? Or it's just like that's never going to.
What we're dealing with as the major reasons it's not, one of the major reasons it's not is scientism. There are there are issues there. There are issues in terms of medical monopoly issues. I mean, to the extent that we accept that people can make their own reality, there's no reason that that couldn't flip.
Yeah, I guess, but that is a metaphysical perspective, and I'm always willing to entertain the metaphysical. I always am. But I live in a town, and my career has been, I live in Washington, and my career has been much more practical policy. But I'm at the point now where I'm looking at things like this and saying, well, like you just pointed out, it was practical policy at one point in our history. And we could say, well, science changed all that. I understand all that. But if it worked, and so much of what we do in our normal primary care system, 80% of it is just better diet, exercise. Chronic illness comes down to lifestyle choices.
Exactly.
So if you are somebody who could aid someone in making better lifestyle choices, let people know what their options are. And that's my concern around the status quo is that so often we don't know what other options used to exist because we got funneled into this is what the money was telling us to do.
And that really is the point so much, Whitney, because what I do is not the problem. What is being done in marketing food products that have no nutritional value is much more dangerous than anything I do. Hippocrates said the biggest cause of disease is what people eat.
Yeah, I do know that because I've read
Yeah,
your book.
yeah.
I took
So,
your class.
that was the major cause of disease. And, I think that's really not a controversial point. It's just people don't want to hear it because what you should be eating is maybe not as tasty um, as that stuff that you got in the middle of the store.
So I guess, wow, that's a whole other conversation. Basically, as we could say, is that our health and everything based around it, our healthcare system and everything that's predicated on the treatment of our 80% of our chronic diseases come down to lifestyle choices. Well, then it's really a money issue. It's really a marketing issue
Mm-hmm.
more than it is a health issue. But I don't want us to go down. I mean, that just I don't,
Another
because
topic for another day.
it is, and it's also it's real, but it's a behemoth. And I am really looking at, well, what little things can I bring to people's attention that we can do something about. So knowing that you exist and that this is a modality that exists for people, that's me saying you can take your power back as a healthcare consumer or just a person who wants to be well, an American who has choices. And I can do that. Taking on, the whole marketing, I don't have the energy and I don't have the resources for that. But this is the sort of thing that I think is important, where people step back and go, well, that's not what I expected, but that's got a history to it that, has efficacy involved. And, I just didn't know about it. But I would imagine that it's also a threat, right? It's a threat to the system as well, that somebody could talk to you and then find out they don't need. I actually think it is a threat to the insurance industry, because if there are things that I can do where I don't need to pay a lot of money to ensure that I don't end up in the healthcare system that I don't even really know how much it costs, but I could do a contractual thing like this and say, we're going to do this, and then we're going to expect a certain outcome, and then I'm going to pay you. Then I don't need the middleman.
Um, I think insurance companies would be very happy if they had to pay out less. The big thing that all of this is talking to is the fact we've got a whole lot more personal choices than we may have thought. Most people have never entertained the idea that time would have a kind of a value that either could be measured or predicted. And the possibility that that might be true is a really interesting extra dimension. It is something you can explore. It's very hard to set up meaningful experiments about it.
Yeah.
But if it works in your own life, that's probably the best measure for you.
Would there ever be research into this, do you think? Meaningful clinical data that could come out of this sort of thing?
It's hard because then you would have to be able to characterize time quantitatively for something that's actually a qualitative measurement. And that's really what the bear of it is. I mean, there have been studies on things like vocations, where there's been some research that is suggestive, but it's setting up something that is both a meaningful measure and a realistic measure. Turns out to be a very difficult thing. But as you know too, I mean, a lot of the allegedly scientific studies, the more you pick them apart, the more you realize they aren't so great. They are not so.
It's true. It's not politically correct
Unbiased.
to talk about that, but you can really find a way to pop a p-value out of just about any data set if you really are committed to doing it for a certain reason.
Sure.
Maybe,
Economics being one of the really big ones.
yeah, I mean, maybe that's too broad of a statement. Maybe I ought to walk that back a little bit. But it's true. There are so many ways that you can get the data to tell you what you want it to tell you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that's always a big danger that and science has tried, collectively, to address these issues of bias, but not always completely successfully. And so this is just, but this is an area of personal choice. If your sense of going through life is one that has some non-material basis, then something like medical astrology may not be that much of a stretch for you.